Welcome back to part 3 of the big story. In the previous video, we saw that as Genesis came to a close, the entire Israelite community, which consisted of 70 people, took up residence in northern Egypt, thanks to Joseph's intervention. That said, this was a far cry from what God had promised Abraham. Remember, God had promised both innumerable descendants as well as a land for them to occupy. And neither of these promises seemed close to fulfillment at this point. It seems then that if these promises are going to come to fruition, God will have to act in a powerful way. And as we'll see in a few moments, he does just that. Now, before we consider what God does, I want us to take note of the fact that 400 years have passed between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. Everyone who was around during the time of Joseph has long since passed, as have several more generations. That said, we read in Exodus 1, verse 7, "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly." Now remember what the Lord promised Abraham in Genesis 17, verse 6. There he declared, "I will make you exceedingly fruitful." It seems then that after 400 years, the Lord has kept his promise to Abraham. He multiplied Abraham's seed while they remained secure in northern Egypt. At the same time, however, Pharaoh's attitude towards this Israelite community turns sour. In addition to placing them under forced labor, Pharaoh sought to stymie Israelite growth by having all the Israelite boys tossed into the Nile River. Well, in an effort to possibly save her own baby boy, a certain Levite woman kept her son hidden for 3 months, and then placed him in a basket and floated him down the river. He was eventually discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, who had compassion on him and raised him in Pharaoh's palace. The boy's name was Moses. Now, even though Moses was raised in Pharaoh's palace, that didn't mean that he wasn't loyal to the Israelites. In fact, when he was about 40 years old, he saw this Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite slave, and in anger, Moses went and killed the Egyptian. But when he discovered that Moses learned of this murder, he fled to the land of Midian. And there he got married. He had children. He even became a shepherd. And about 40 years later, while he was out tending his flock on Mount Horeb, which is just another name for Mount Sinai, Moses encountered the Lord in a burning bush. There the Lord spoke to Moses and told him that he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And because he had heard the Israelites cry, he was going to send Moses back into Egypt to deliver the people out of bondage. Moses, however, is a bit skeptical of this plan. After all, he wasn't even sure the people knew who God was. It had been 400 years since they had been in Egypt, and God had been more or less silent. So when Moses asked God what his name was, God replied in Exodus 3:14, "Ehyeh Asher Ayeh." I am who I am. This phrase, of course, is a reference to the name Yahweh, the personal, covenantal name of God. And throughout the Old Testament, the name Yahweh is always translated as Lord with all capital letters. Well, after a few miraculous signs, the Lord convinced Moses to take his brother Aaron and go ask Pharaoh for the release of the Israelites, so that they could go worship out in the wilderness. But when Moses asked him, Pharaoh replied in Exodus 5, verse 2, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go?" You see, Pharaoh doesn't know Yahweh yet, but he will soon enough. Of course, Pharaoh's rejection of Moses comes as no surprise. After all, the Lord told Moses in the previous chapter that he would harden Pharaoh's heart. And this hardening was for a specific purpose. As we're told several times throughout Exodus, it's so that the whole world would know who Yahweh was. Exodus 7:5 says, "It's so that the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." Or as the Lord tells Pharaoh in chapter 9, verse 16, "But for this purpose I have raised you up, to show you my power, so that my name will be proclaimed in all the earth." You see, Pharaoh's hard heart led to increased plagues, which showed off the power and might of the Lord. If Israel would have had an easy release out of Egypt, then God would have been robbed of all of his glory, and Israel and the surrounding nations would not have known of his mighty power. As Michael Morales notes, to have released Israel immediately, apart from God's mighty display of signs and wonders, would have been no true exodus at all. All the people's hearts would not have welled up in wondrous praise of his glory. And not only did God show off his glory, he did so at the expense of the Egyptian gods. Numbers 33 verse 4 notes, "On their gods also the Lord executed judgment." The Lord, for example, demonstrated his power over the god of the Nile River, and over the frog goddess, and the earth god, and the fly god, the god of the livestock, the god of healing, the goddess of the sky, the god over the locusts, and the sun gods. The 10th and final plague was an attack on Pharaoh, whom the Egyptians believed to be a god himself. This 10th plague, where the Lord killed the firstborn son, was ultimately what compelled Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. This plague is also associated with the Passover, where the Lord instructed the Israelites to slaughter a lamb and spread its blood over their doorposts. And in the middle of the night, when the angel of death came through the land of Egypt, if the angel saw the blood covering the doorposts, he would pass over their homes and spare the firstborn sons. None of the Egyptians, however, covered their doorposts with blood. As a result, all their firstborn sons were killed. This can perhaps be seen as just retribution, since the Egyptians had mistreated Yahweh's firstborn son. As the Lord says in Exodus 4, verse 22, "Israel is my firstborn son." After the Passover, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt to the Red Sea. But Pharaoh's heart, once again, becomes hardened, and he chases after them. While the people begin to worry and even start complaining, the Lord performs a remarkable sign by parting the sea so that the people could walk through on dry land. After crossing over, the waters came crashing down on those pursuing Egyptians. The Lord had rescued his people. And this event is what the rest of the Old Testament authors continually look back to as the redemptive act of the Old Covenant. God had rescued his people out of bondage and has established them as his covenantal people. And every year, the Lord wanted the Israelites to commemorate this event by celebrating the annual Passover. And every year, they would retell the story of how a lamb was sacrificed in their place so that they could be spared. The Passover lamb, of course, prefigures what Christ would ultimately do for his people. He would be slaughtered, and his blood would be shed. And anyone who is covered in that blood would be spared from God's judgment. Additionally, this event shows the Lord rescuing the seed of the woman while dealing a crushing blow to the seed of the serpent. If ever a person or people group represented the serpent in the Old Testament, it was Pharaoh and the Egyptians. In fact, later authors repeatedly reflect back on the Exodus as a defeat of the serpent. Before we consider those texts, though, let's first consider that the serpent can take two different forms in Scripture depending on his purpose. If he wishes to devour his enemies, he takes the form of a sea dragon or a sea monster. If he wishes to deceive, he takes the form of a snake. Consistently throughout later Old Testament writings, the Exodus event is portrayed as a defeat against the sea dragon, who is sometimes called Leviathan or Rahab. Consider a few examples. Exodus 29, verse 3 remarks, "Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lies in the midst of his streams." The psalmist, as he reflected upon the Exodus, remarks, "You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan." Again, Isaiah says of the Lord, "Was it not you who cut Rahab to pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea? Or Psalm 89, verses 9 and 10. You rule the raging sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. Again and again, the later Old Testament writers portray the Exodus event as a time when the Lord crushed the head of the serpent. And this allusion comes even more into focus when we understand that the ancient headdress of Pharaoh was a cobra, the image of an Egyptian goddess who was supposedly the matron protector of Egypt. Apparently, she was no match for Yahweh. So in short, the Lord rescued the seed of the woman from the seed of the serpent. Well, as Israel made its way through the wilderness, they eventually made their way back to the same mountain where Moses first met with the Lord in the burning bush, Mount Sinai. And here, the Israelites are going to remain for almost a year, up until Numbers chapter 11. At Mount Sinai, the Lord established his covenant with the nation of Israel. As the mediator, the Lord summons Moses up the mountain to meet with him in the cloud. And after receiving the book of the covenant, which included the 10 commandments, Moses came down the mountain and he read it to the people. And then Exodus 24, verse 7 reports, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And then to ratify this covenant, verse 8 notes, and Moses took the blood and he threw it on the people. And he said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. As was true with the Abrahamic covenant, where the animals were sliced in half, this covenant is also ratified with blood. And it will be true of the new covenant as well. Listen to Jesus' words in the upper room in Luke 22, verse 20. He says, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. A clear allusion back to what Moses said in Exodus 24. The Lord then instructed Moses to head back up the mountain to receive more of his law, specifically laws on the priesthood and instructions for building the tabernacle. And while Moses remains up on the mountain inside the cloud, the people down at the bottom begin to wonder what's happened to this Moses since he's been up there for 40 days and nights. Well, this impatience leads to a terrible decision. Exodus 32, verse 1 reports, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, up, make us gods who shall go before us. And for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron took the people's jewelry and he fashioned it into a golden calf, something the second commandment clearly forbade. And then Aaron says in verses 4 to 6, there are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. That is to say, it looks as if the Israelites have created this golden calf to represent Yahweh. Well, when the Lord saw that this had happened, he instructed Moses to go down the mountain. And as Moses descended, he could hear singing and what sounded like shouts of victory from a distance. And as he got closer, he saw people dancing around this golden calf. And in anger, Moses smashed the tablets, symbolizing that the people had broken the covenant that they had made with the Lord not too long ago. Moses then burned the calf in fire. He ground it up into powder, he tossed it into the water, and he made the people drink it. Moses then ordered the Levites to kill 3,000 of the guilty culprits. Moses knew, however, that the Lord's anger burned hot against the Israelites. He knew the Lord would have been perfectly just to wipe them all out and just start over. So we read in Exodus 32, verses 30 and following, Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, alas, This people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." But the Lord said to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my books." In other words, Moses offered himself as an atoning sacrifice for the sins of the people, but the Lord rejected his offer. Instead, the Lord sent a plague on the people for their judgment. While at Sinai, Moses continued to meet with the Lord in the tent of meeting outside the camp. In fact, we read in Exodus 33, verse 11, "Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend." And as a result of being in the presence of the glory of the Lord, Moses' face would still be shining when he left the Lord's presence and came back to the people. And due to Moses' ongoing intercession, the Lord forgave the Israelites. He even gave Moses new tablets and renewed the covenant with him once more. And as the Lord gave these new tablets to Moses, he gave what is probably the most significant revelation of himself in the entire Old Testament. He remarks in Exodus 34, verses 6 to 7, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Later Old Testament authors will refer back to this text time and time again to remind their listeners of God's nature. He's not like any of the other so-called pagan gods who were whimsical, bloodthirsty, and erratic. No, he's a God of steadfast love. We frequently take it for granted, but a loving God was absolutely unheard of in the ancient world. You didn't simply have a relationship with the gods back then. You feared them and you tried to appease them as best as you could, but that's it. Well, since the Lord forgave Israel, he promised that he would go with them into the promised land. And for that to be possible, they would need to construct the tabernacle before setting out from Sinai. The tabernacle was going to be God's dwelling place on the earth. Its significance then cannot be overstated because ever since the Garden of Eden, people had been expelled from God's presence. Sinful people cannot just dwell in the midst of a holy God lest they be consumed. The tabernacle was going to function then as God's gracious resolution to this problem. It was going to function like a portable Garden of Eden. And we know this because we see lots of parallels between the tabernacle and later temple with the garden. For example, Adam was instructed to work and keep the garden. The priests were instructed to work and keep the tabernacle. God walked with humanity in the garden. With the tabernacle, we read in Leviticus 26 that God walked among his people. The entrance of the garden faced the east. The entrance to the tabernacle and temple faced the east. The garden had the tree of life. The tabernacle had the golden lampstand, which looked like a tree with a trunk and 7 protruding branches with flowering almond blossoms. Cherubim guarded the entrance to the garden, and cherubim guarded the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. Cherubim were also embroidered on the veil to the Holy of Holies. A river flows down and out of Eden. A river flowed down and out of the temple in Ezekiel 47. The gardens filled with trees and flowers. On the temple walls, they carved gourds, flowers, and palm trees. And once this tabernacle was complete, the glory of the Lord rested upon it in the form of a giant cloud of smoke. Now, this was a remarkable privilege for the people of Israel. Just as he had chosen their forefather Abraham, he has now chosen the Israelites to be his covenantal people. Listen to these words in Deuteronomy 7, verses 6 and following. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all the peoples. But it was because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery. In other words, Israel should never think they deserve to be God's chosen people. God chose them by grace alone. Well, at Sinai, the cloud of smoke finally lifted from the tabernacle and began to lead the people through the wilderness. The people were instructed to follow the cloud by day and the fire by night. The plan was for the Lord to lead Israel directly into the promised land. However, before they entered, Moses sent 12 spies to go scout out the land. 10 of the spies came back with a negative report, saying it would be too difficult for them to enter. The cities were well fortified, and the people were too big, and the armies looked too strong. 2 spies, however, disagreed. Joshua and Caleb, they said the land was ripe for the taking. After all, God had promised that he would give them this land. Well, sadly, the Israelites listened to the 10 cowardly spies instead of trusting the Lord. And as a result, the Lord judged Israel and forced them to wander through the wilderness for 40 years. Moreover, he declared that every person over the age of 20 would die before they got to enter the land. Only the 2 good spies would be able to enter Canaan. And so Israel begins a long 40 years of wandering through the wilderness. All the while they complain about food and water and their general circumstances. Even though the people have rejected God's promises and even though they complain constantly, the Lord continuously, miraculously provides manna and quail for them to eat and water for them to drink. The manna was this bread-like substance that simply appeared on the ground every morning. And God provided so much quail that they ran out of different ways to make it. The Lord also provided water from the rock by having Moses either hit it or speak to it. Either way, the Lord sustained the people and provided for them during this 40-year wandering. On 2 particular occasions, though, the Lord's anger burned hot against the Israelites. One occurs in Numbers 16 when a certain faction, led by a man named Korah, decided that they should be in charge instead of Moses. In an act of vindication for Moses, God sent an earthquake which split the ground and swallowed up Korah and everyone else who had united with him. And again, in Numbers chapter 21, the people were complaining once more to God and Moses, saying, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" So the Lord sent fiery serpents to bite the people, so that many were poisoned and died. Now, the use of the serpents is hardly coincidental. By complaining against the Lord, the people were doing the serpent's bidding and were acting like the seed of the serpent themselves. Once they repented, the Lord instructed Moses to make a bronze serpent and hang it on a pole. And anyone who looked upon it and looked upon that lifted up serpent, they would be healed. Well, after 40 long years, and the Lord's faithful provision of Israel through the wilderness, even giving them victory in battle against their enemies, they arrive at the plains of Moab on the eastern side of the land of Canaan. Now, Balak, the king of Moab, has heard about Yahweh's power, and he knew that his people could not defeat the Israelites on their own. So he summoned a sorcerer from Babylon named Balaam. He hoped that Balaam could get all the deities on the side of Moab. But Balak's plan backfired. Not only could Balak not bring down curses upon Israel, the Lord forced him to only offer blessings to Israel, which infuriated Balak. Even at one point, the Lord gave Balaam the ability to prophesy about Israel's future Messiah. In Numbers 24, verse 17, Balaam remarks, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Now that's a remarkable prophecy. Not only does Balaam repeat the scepter language that was used of Judah in Genesis 49, he speaks of this star which will rise from Jacob, who will crush the forehead of Moab. Again, that's a clear allusion to Genesis 3:15, where the Lord promised that the seed of the woman would one day crush the head of the serpent. When we come to the book of Deuteronomy, Israel is still situated on the plains of Moab, waiting to enter the promised land. 40 years have passed since Mount Sinai, and the previous generation has all died out because of their refusal to enter the land. So Moses gives the law a second time. That's what Deuteronomy means. Deutero, second, nomos, law, second law. He urges them to obey all the words of the Lord if they want everything to go well with them in the land. But he also warns them of God's curses, even exile from the land, if they disobey the Lord. Now, as Deuteronomy comes to a close, the Lord told Moses that he would die before entering the land. But before he died, he made a promise that he would raise up another prophet like him. As Deuteronomy 18:18 states, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. Well, when we come to the end of Deuteronomy, we read that Moses died and was buried in Moab before entering into the land. And obviously somebody other than Moses wrote this last part of Deuteronomy. In fact, most conservative scholars would agree that while Moses wrote most of the Pentateuch, a later scribe wrote this final portion, sometimes near the end of the Old Testament era. For Deuteronomy 34:10 remarks, and there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. In other words, a long time had passed, but the prophet like Moses hasn't come along yet. Not Elijah, not Elisha, not even Isaiah. The prophet like Moses doesn't come until Jesus. So how do we know this? How does Jesus show himself to be the prophet like Moses? Well, here are some similarities. Both are the only two individuals in the Bible born under death decree, Moses with Pharaoh and Jesus with Herod. As infants, both are placed in straw-thatched baskets. Both escape into the heart of Egypt as infants. Both became covenant mediators. Both led their people out of bondage and slavery. Both gave or received instruction on a mountain. Both of their faces shine on the mountain. Both are isolated for 40 days, and both are rebelled against by the Israelites. But with these similarities, we must also recognize some important differences. First, as a prophet, Moses said, "Thus says the Lord." Jesus, on the other hand, simply said, "Truly, truly, I say to you." In other words, Jesus didn't need to appeal to an outside authority like Moses. Second, we read that Moses constructed a tabernacle so that God could dwell with his people. Jesus, on the other hand, became the tabernacle and dwelt among his people. Third, Moses offered people water from the rock. But Jesus is the rock who provides living water. And fourth, though Moses offered himself as an atoning sacrifice, God rejected his offer. Jesus' offer, however, was accepted because he was the right man for the job. As the author of Hebrews remarks, "For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son." In short, Jesus is the greater Moses.